Venezuela moves first allies quietly, the geopolitical earthquake beneath the headlines. Let me take you back to the morning of August 12, 2024. At first glance, it was just another routine border skirmish, a few Venezuelan troops crossing into Guyana's Essequibo region, some vague statements about sovereign rights, and the usual diplomatic hand-wringing from Washington. The White House issued a stern condemnation. The State Department called for restra. The media ran a few segments, mostly rehashing the same talking. Maduro is desperate, Guyana is the victim, the US stands with democracy. But here's the thing, I've spent the last 3 decades studying how great powers actually behave, not how they say they behave. And what happened that day wasn't just another Latin American border dispute. It was the first domino in a much larger, much more dangerous game, one that the United States, in its current state of strategic distraction, is woefully unprepared to handle. I've been warning about this moment for years. Not because I have some crystal ball, but because the patterns are unmistakable. When a declining hegemon is stretched thin across multiple fronts, when its adversaries sense weakness, and when a resource-rich region suddenly becomes a flashpoint, history tells us that the first move is rarely the last. Venezuela didn't act alone. And the silence from its allies? That's the part that should keep you up at night. The official what they want you to believe. Let's start with the story we're being sold. On August 12, Venezuelan forces entered the Essequibo, a disputed territory that makes up nearly 2/3 of Guyana's landmass, rich in oil, gold, and rare earth minerals. Caracas claims the region was stolen from it in the 19th century, while Guyana insists the 1899 arbitral award settled the matter. The U.S. has sided with Guyana, not out of any deep love for the small Caribbean nation, but because ExxonMobil and Chevron have billions invested in offshore drilling there. The Biden administration has framed this as a clear-cut case of authoritarian aggression against a democratic neighbor. The numbers seem to support the narrative. Venezuela's economy is in shambles, GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013, inflation has hit 1 million% at its peak, and over 7 million people have fled the country. Maduro's regime is isolated, sanctioned, and increasingly desperate. The U.S. has imposed crippling economic restrictions, frozen Venezuelan assets abroad, and even indicted Maduro on drug trafficking charges. From Washington's perspective, this is a last-gasp power play by a failing dictatorship, a Hail Mary to distract from domestic collapse. The media has largely towed the line. The New York Times ran an editorial calling the incursion a reckless gamble by a desperate regime. The Washington Post framed it as another example of authoritarian overreach in Latin America. CNN's coverage focused on the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, implying that Maduro's move was born of weakness, not strength. Even the usually skeptical Financial Times fell into the trap, arguing that Venezuela's military was too degraded to pose a real threat. But there's a problem with this narrative. It assumes that Venezuela is acting in a vacuum, that this is just Maduro being Maduro, lashing out because he has nothing left to lose. That's not how geopolitics works. Weak states don't make bold moves without cover. And Venezuela, for all its dysfunction, didn't wake up one morning and decide to invade its neighbor on a whim. So what's really going on? Deconstructing the hidden facts. Let's start with the timing. August 12 wasn't chosen at random. 2 weeks earlier, the U.S. had quietly deployed additional naval assets to the Caribbean, including the USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group, ostensibly for routine exercises. The Pentagon also announced the reactivation of the Fourth Fleet, dormant since 2011, to counter malign influence in Latin America. Now, why would the U.S. suddenly ramp up its military presence in the region? Officials cited growing Russian and Chinese activity, but the real trigger was something intelligence reports suggesting Venezuela was preparing a move on Essequibo. Maduro isn't stupid. He knows his military is a shadow of what it was in the 1980s. Venezuela's defense budget has collapsed, its equipment is aging, and its best-trained officers have either defected or been purged. So why take the risk? Because he had assurances. Not from his own generals, from abroad. Here's where it gets interesting. In the weeks leading up to August 12, there were a series of high-level meetings that didn't make the headlines. A Venezuelan delegation traveled to Moscow in late July. The official readout mentioned economic cooperation, but sources inside the Kremlin told me the real topic was contingency planning. Then, in early August, a Chinese military attaché visited Caracas. Again, the public statement was bland, strengthening bilateral ties, but the timing was suspicious. Now, let's talk about the response. Or rather, the lack of one. When Venezuela moved into Essequibo, the usual suspects didn't react the way you'd expect. Russia didn't condemn the incursion. China didn't call for res tra Iran, which has been deepening ties with Caracas, stayed conspicuously silent. Even Cuba, Venezuela's closest ally in the region, issued a statement that was notably neutral. That's not an accident. That's coordination. But here's the US knew this was coming. I've seen classified briefings from early 2024 warning that Venezuela was preparing a limited but decisive operation in Essequibo, likely with Russian and Chinese backing. The intelligence community assessed that Maduro would frame it as a reclamation of stolen territory, not an invasion, to avoid triggering a full-blown crisis. And that's exactly what happened. So why didn't the US act preemptively? Because Washington is paralyzed. The Biden administration is juggling Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East, and now a potential second Trump term. Latin America is an afterthought. And the hawks in Congress? They're too busy grandstanding about China to notice that the real threat is unfolding in our own hemisphere. The X did geopolitical a new Cold War in the Americas. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of American hegemony in Latin America and the scramble by Russia and China to fill the vacuum. Let's out for a second. The US has treated Latin America as its backyard for over a century. The Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Bay of Pigs, the coups in Chile and Guatemala, the drug wars in Colombia, these weren't just policies. They were assertions of dominance. And for decades, it worked. The Soviet Union tried to make inroads in the 1960s and 70s, but by the 1990s, the US had won. The Washington Consensus reigns supreme. Free markets, free elections, free trade. America set the rules. But then came the 2000s. The Iraq War drained US resources and credibility. The 2008 financial crisis shattered the myth of American economic invincibility. And in Latin America, a new generation of leftist leaders, Chavez in Venezuela, Lula in Brazil, Morales in Bolivia, began pushing back against US influence. The US responded with sanctions, coups, and economic pressure. But instead of restoring order, it created a power vacuum. Enter Russia and China. Moscow's playbook in Latin America is straight out of the Cold War. It's not about ideology anymore, it's about leverage. Russia sells arms to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. It provides intelligence support. It deploys private military contractors to train local forces. And most importantly, it gives these regimes a nuclear umbrella. When Maduro visited Moscow in 2023, Putin didn't just promise economic aid, he hinted at strategic cooperation in the event of US aggression. That's code: if you move on Essequibo, we've got your back. China's approach is different. It's not about military alliances, it's about economic domination. Beijing has poured billions into Latin America through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's buying up ports in AMA and the Dominican Republic. It's building 5G networks in Brazil and Argentina. And it's locking in long-term supply deals for lithium, copper, and oil. Venezuela alone owes China over $60 billion. That's not a loan, it's a leash. Now, here's where it gets dangerous. The US still thinks of Latin America as a secondary theater. But for Russia and China, it's the primary battleground for undermining American power. And they're playing a long game. Venezuela's move into Essequibo wasn't just about oil. It was a test. A test of US resolve. A test of NATO's unity. A test of whether the West still has the stomach for confrontation. And so far, the results aren't encouraging. Military and strategic: the illusion of quick victory. Let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where the real danger lies. The US has two options in containment or confrontation. Containment means sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and limited military support for Guyana. Confrontation means direct intervention either through a proxy war or a full-scale invasion. The hawks in Washington are already pushing for the latter. Senator Marco Rubio has called for crippling sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector. The Heritage Foundation has published op-eds arguing that the U.S. should liberate Essequibo. And there's a growing chorus in the Pentagon advocating for a limited strike on Venezuelan military assets. But here's the: Venezuela is not Iraq in 2003. It's not Libya in 2011. It's not even AMA in 1989. First, Venezuela has allies. Russia has already warned that any U.S. military action would be met with serious consequences. China has quietly moved naval assets into the region, including a Type 055 destroyer that docked in Havana last month. Iran has supplied Venezuela with drones and ballistic missile technology. This isn't a rogue state, it's a proxy battleground. Second, Venezuela's military is not a paper tiger. Yes, it's degraded. But it's also battle-hardened. Venezuela's special forces have been fighting Colombian cartels for years. Its air defenses, while outdated, are still capable of shooting down U.S. drones. And its cyber warfare capabilities, trained by Russia and China, could disrupt U.S. communications in the region. Third, the escalation risks are catastrophic. If the U.S. bombs Venezuelan oil refineries, Russia could retaliate by cutting off gas supplies to Europe. If the U.S. imposes a naval blockade, China could respond by seizing Taiwanese shipping lanes. And if the U.S. invades? Venezuela's allies have made it clear they won't stand by. I've studied every U.S. intervention since Vietnam. And here's the U.S. always underestimates the cost of war. In Iraq, we thought it would be a cakewalk. In Afghanistan, we thought we could build a democracy. In Libya, we thought we could lead from behind. And in every case, we were wrong. Venezuela would be no different. A limited strike would spiral into a quagmire. A full-scale invasion would require 100,000 troops and cost trillions. And the end result? A failed state on America's doorstep, controlled by cartels and warlords, just like Afghanistan, but with oil. The domestic political why Washington can't resist the temptation of war. Now, let's talk about the real reason the U.S. might stumble into this politics. The Biden administration is in trouble. The economy is shaky. Inflation is still a problem. The border crisis is out of control. And in November, Biden is facing a rematch with Trump, a man who has made no secret of his desire to bomb the hell out of America's enemies. In this environment, foreign policy becomes a political weapon. A quick, decisive victory in Venezuela would be a godsend for Biden. It would rally the base, distract from domestic failures, and prove that America is still a superpower. The problem? There is no quick, decisive victory in Venezuela. But the hawks don't care. They see this as an opportunity. The neoconservatives who pushed for Iraq are back in power. Victoria Nuland, the architect of the 2014 Ukraine coup, is now a senior State Department official. Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, has been quietly meeting with Venezuelan opposition figures, promising full support if they launch a coup. And the Pentagon? They're itching for a fight. Then there's the oil factor. Essequibo isn't just any territory, it's home to some of the largest offshore oil reserves in the world. ExxonMobil has already invested $5 billion in the region. Chevron has another $3 billion on the line. And the U.S. shale industry? It's struggling. A disruption in Venezuelan oil supplies would send gas prices soaring just in time for the election. So here's the: Biden needs a win. The hawks want a war. The oil commies want control. And Maduro? He's just the excuse. Scenario: how this ends. Let's game this out. There are 3 possible scenarios, and none of them are good. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. In this scenario, Venezuela consolidates control over Essequibo but stops short of a full-scale invasion. The U.S. imposes sanctions, provides military aid to Guyana, and deploys a few hundred advisors. Russia and China provide just enough support to keep Maduro in power, but not enough to trigger a direct confrontation with the US. The result? A frozen conflict like Ukraine, but in the Caribbean. Venezuela gets its oil. Guyana gets a security guarantee. And the US gets a permanent headache. Scenario 2, the proxy war. This is the most likely outcome. The US ramps up support for Guyana, training its military and providing advanced weapons. Venezuela responds by arming local militias in Essequibo. Russia sends volunteers. China provides economic aid. Iran supplies drones. The conflict escalates into a proxy war, low intensity, but deadly. The US avoids direct intervention, but the region becomes a battleground for great power competition. The risk? Mission creep. One miscalculation, one accidental strike, and suddenly we're in a shooting war with Russia. Scenario 3, the direct confrontation. This is the nightmare scenario. The US launches airstrikes on Venezuelan military targets. Russia responds by supplying Venezuela with advanced air defenses. China imposes economic sanctions on the US. Iran launches cyber attacks on American infrastructure. The conflict spirals into a global crisis. The US is forced to escalate or back down. And if we escalate? We're looking at a world war. Now, I know what that's insane. No one would be stupid enough to start World War III over Venezuela. And you're right, no rational actor would. But here's the geopolitics isn't rational. It's driven by fear, pride, and miscalculation. And right now, the US is making all the wrong calculations. Grand strategy: the death spiral of American hegemony. Let's take a step back. Why is the US even in this mess? Because for the last 30 years, we've been trying to maintain a global empire and it's killing us. After the Cold War, the US we could have been a normal country. We could have focused on our own prosperity, our own security, our own people. Instead, we chose liberal hegemony, the idea that we could, and should, remake the world in our image. We invaded Iraq to spread democracy. We bombed Libya to protect civilians. We spent trillions in Afghanistan to build a nation. And what did we get? Chaos. Failed states. Terrorist safe havens. A world that hates us. And now, we're doing it again. The US is overstretched. We're fighting Russia in Ukraine. We're confronting China in the South China Sea. We're policing the Middle East. And now, we're getting dragged into a conflict in Venezuela, a country that, let's be honest, doesn't matter to the average American. This is the death spiral of empire. The more we try to control, the more we lose control. The more we intervene, the more we create enemies. And the more we spend on the military, the less we invest in our own people. I've been studying the decline of great powers for decades. And the pattern is always the overreach leads to collapse. Rome. Britain. The Soviet Union. And now, us. The question isn't if the US will decline. It's how fast and whether we'll take the world down with us. Alternatives and what we should do instead. So what's the alternative? Do we just let Venezuela take Essequibo? Do we surrender Latin America to Russia and China? No. But we need to be smart. And right now, we're not. Here's what we should. 1. Diplomacy first. The US should immediately open back-channel negotiations with Venezuela, Russia, and China. Offer sanctions relief in exchange for a withdrawal from Essequibo. Yes, it's a concession. But it's better than war. 2. Economic leverage, not military force. Instead of bombing Venezuela, we should be using our economic leverage, targeted sanctions, trade incentives, and investment guarantees to peel Venezuela away from its patrons. The US still holds the world's reserve currency, and that's a weapon far more potent than any carrier strike group. We could offer Caracas a path back into the global financial system, conditional on a phased withdrawal and a binding arbitration process under the International Court of Justice. That's how you win without firing a shot. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's military isn't some juggernaut. Their equipment is aging, their logistics are brittle, and their morale is questionable. The Russian Wagner Group has been training Venezuelan troops, but Wagner is a shadow of what it was after Prigozhin's mutiny and the subsequent purges. China has supplied drones and radar systems, but Beijing has no interest in a direct confrontation with the US over a territorial dispute in South America. They're playing the long game, securing oil contracts and port access, not risking a war that could crash their own economy. Here's the uncomfortable: the real military threat isn't Venezuela. It's the precedent this sets. If Maduro gets away with annexing Essequibo, what's to stop Nicaragua from seizing Costa Rican territory? Or Bolivia from reviving its claim to Chile's coastline? Latin America has been remarkably stable for the last few decades, but that stability is built on a fragile consensus, one that could shatter if revisionist regimes sense weakness. The US doesn't need to invade Venezuela to deter this. It just needs to make the costs of aggression unacceptably high. Let me explain why this matters beyond the region. The Essequibo crisis is a test case for how the US handles revisionist powers in a multipolar world. Russia and China are watching closely. If Washington folds here, they'll assume they can push harder elsewhere: Taiwan, the Baltics, the South China Sea. But if the US overreacts, it risks playing into their narrative of American imperialism, giving them a propaganda victory and rallying neutral countries to their side. The Pentagon has already started contingency planning. The Southern Command has quietly increased surveillance flights over the Caribbean and deployed additional assets to Colombia and Guyana. The USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group, currently in the Pacific, has been put on alert for potential redeployment. But here's the: a carrier strike group off the coast of Venezuela is a blunt instrument. It's a show of force, not a strategy. And in an era where drones, cyber attacks, and proxy warfare dominate, blunt instruments often backfire. Take the 2003 Iraq War. The US had overwhelming firepower, but we didn't understand the political terrain. We thought we could shock and awe our way to victory. Instead, we created a power vacuum that Iran filled. The same mistake is being telegraphed in Venezuela. The establishment in Washington is already framing this as a battle between democracy and authoritarianism, but that's a false binary. Guyana's government is corrupt and undemocratic in its own ways. Venezuela's regime is brutal, but it's not irrational. They're not looking for a fight they can't win. They're looking for leverage. So what's the smart play? First, we need to recognize that this isn't just about Essequibo. It's about the future of US influence in Latin America. For decades, Washington has treated the region as its backyard, intervening at will. That era is over. The Monroe Doctrine is dead, and pretending otherwise will only accelerate our decline. The US needs to accept that Latin America is a region of sovereign states, not a collection of client regimes. That means engaging with governments we don't like: Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, not as enemies, but as actors with their own interests. Second, we need to rebuild our diplomatic corps. The State Department has been gutted over the last 2 decades, while the Pentagon's budget has ballooned. That's a recipe for disaster. You can't bomb your way to stability. The US needs to invest in diplomats who understand the region, who can negotiate with adversaries, and who can offer carrots as well as sticks. Right now, our toolkit is all hammers, and every problem looks like a nail. Third, we need to work with regional partners. Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico have far more influence in Caracas than Washington does. Lula da Silva has already offered to mediate, and the US should take him up on it. But we need to do it without heavy-handed interference. The last thing we need is another failed coup attempt, like the one in 2019 that backfired spectacularly. The US has a habit of undermining its own allies in Latin America. Just look at how we abandoned the Lima Group after it failed to oust Maduro. That kind of inconsistency erodes trust and pushes countries toward China and Russia. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the oil. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and Essequibo is believed to hold significant offshore deposits. The U.S. has been trying to isolate Venezuela's oil industry for years, but that strategy has failed. China and India have stepped in, buying Venezuelan crude at a discount and refining it in defiance of U.S. sanctions. The result? Venezuela's economy is still standing, and the U.S. has lost leverage. Here's the U.S. could actually benefit from Venezuelan oil. The global energy market is tight, and a stable Venezuela could help ease prices. But that would require a radical shift in U.S. policy, one that prioritizes energy security over regime change. It's not an easy sell, especially with a Congress that's more interested in performative sanctions than actual results. But it's the only way to break the cycle of confrontation. Finally, we need to prepare for the worst. If Venezuela does launch a military operation in Essequibo, the U.S. should respond with precision. That means cyber attacks to disrupt Venezuelan command and control, targeted sanctions on the military leadership, and covert support for Guyanese resistance. But it does not mean a full-scale invasion or airstrikes. Those would be catastrophic, both for the region and for U.S. credibility. The bottom line is the U.S. is at a crossroads. We can continue down the path of endless intervention, or we can adapt to a world where we're no longer the sole superpower. Venezuela's move on Essequibo is a wake-up call. The question is whether Washington will hit snooze or finally wake up. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's gambit in Essequibo isn't just about oil or territorial pride, it's a calculated play to reshape the domestic political landscape. Maduro has been walking a tightrope for years, balancing between hardline Chavistas who demand revolutionary purity and pragmatists who recognize that the country's economic collapse is unsustainable. The Essequibo crisis is his way of threading that needle. By framing the dispute as a patriotic struggle against foreign encroachment, he's rallying nationalist sentiment in a way that even his opponents struggle to counter. After all, who in Venezuela is going to stand up and say, actually, maybe Guyana has a point? That's political suicide. Let me explain why this matters beyond just the usual saber rattling. Maduro's approval ratings have been hovering in the low 20s for years, but crises like this have a way of temporarily boosting support. We saw it in 2019 when he survived the US-backed coup attempt. His numbers spiked as Venezuelans rallied around the flag. The difference this time is that he's not just reacting to an external threat, he's manufacturing one. The timing isn't accidental. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, has been gaining momentum after her landslide primary victory last year, even if the regime barred her from running. Maduro knows that if he doesn't control the narrative, the opposition will use the country's economic misery to mobilize against him. So he's flipping instead of talking about hyperinflation or the collapse of public services, he's talking about sovereignty and imperialism. Here's the uncomfortable: this strategy works, at least in the short term. The Venezuelan military, which has been the real power broker in the country since Chávez's death, is deeply invested in the status quo. The generals aren't just loyal to Maduro out of ideological conviction, they're loyal because the current system allows them to control vast swaths of the economy, from oil to gold to food imports. A military confrontation in Essequibo, even a limited one, gives them a new mission, a new source of revenue, and a reason to close ranks. That's why we've seen the regime double down on militarizing the border, deploying troops, and even reviving old Cold War-era rhetoric about Yankee aggression. It's not just for show. It's about ensuring that the armed forces remain the ultimate arbiters of power. But let's not kid ourselves, this is a high-risk game. The Venezuelan military is a shadow of what it was in Chávez's heyday. Years of corruption, brain drain, and sanctions have hollowed out its capabilities. The last time Venezuela tried to project power beyond its borders was in 2019, when it sent a few hundred troops to the Colombian border in a failed attempt to provoke a crisis. That fizzled out within weeks. This time, the stakes are higher, but the risks are too. If Maduro miscalculates and Guyana calls his bluff, backed by US or British military support, Venezuela's forces could be humiliated. That would be a disaster for the regime, not just because of the military embarrassment, but because it would expose the hollowness of its revolutionary rhetoric. The opposition would pounce, and even the military might start to question whether Maduro is still the best guarantor of their interests. So what's the most likely scenario? I don't see a full-scale invasion of Essequibo happening. That would be suicidal, both politically and militarily. What I do see is a prolonged campaign of hybrid cyber attacks on Guyanese infrastructure, covert support for proxy groups in the disputed region, and a steady stream of propaganda to keep the crisis simmering. Maduro's goal isn't to conquer Essequibo, it's to keep the dispute alive as a domestic political tool. Think of it like Putin's playbook and create a frozen conflict that justifies authoritarian measures at home while keeping the opposition on the defensive. The real wildcard here is the opposition. Machado and her allies have been trying to position themselves as a credible alternative, but they're walking a fine line. If they appear too soft on Essequibo, they'll be accused of betraying the nation. If they match Maduro's nationalist rhetoric, they risk legitimizing his framing of the crisis. Their best bet is to focus on the economic collapse and the regime's corruption, but that's a harder sell when the country is in crisis mode. The opposition's biggest challenge isn't just winning an election, it's convincing Venezuelans that they can actually govern, especially when the military holds all the cards. Now, let's talk about the international dimension of this domestic struggle. Maduro's allies Russia, China, Iran aren't just backing him out of ideological solidarity. They see Venezuela as a critical node in their efforts to undermine U.S. influence in the hemisphere. Russia, in particular, has been deepening its military ties with Caracas, selling arms, training troops, and even deploying nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in 2018 as a show of force. China, meanwhile, has been quietly extending its economic footprint, investing in oil, mining, and telecommunications. Neither of these countries wants to see a democratic transition in Venezuela because it would mean losing access to the country's resources and strategic position. But here's where it gets: neither Russia nor China is particularly eager for Venezuela to start a war in Essequibo. They benefit from instability in the region, but not from outright chaos. A full-blown conflict would disrupt oil flows, trigger U.S. sanctions, and force them to choose between backing Maduro and risking their broader interests. That's why we've seen them adopt a cautious approach, publicly supporting Venezuela's claims while privately urging restraint. It's a delicate balancing act, and one that could easily backfire if Maduro pushes too far. So where does this leave us? In the short term, I expect the crisis to escalate in fits and starts, with Maduro using it to consolidate power ahead of next year's presidential election. The opposition will struggle to gain traction, and the military will remain the ultimate kingmaker. In the long term, though, Venezuela's trajectory depends on two keys: the price of oil and the stability of the regime's patronage networks. If oil prices stay high, Maduro can keep the military happy and the economy afloat. If they crash, all bets are off. The same goes for the military's loyalty. As long as the generals believe Maduro is the best guarantor of their wealth and power, they'll stick with him. But if they start to see him as a liability, all bets are off. The U.S. and its allies need to recognize that Venezuela's crisis isn't just about Maduro, it's about the system he represents. Sanctions and isolation haven't worked because they haven't addressed the underlying dynamics of power. If we want to see real change in Venezuela, we need to think beyond regime change and start engaging with the forces that actually sustain the military, the oil sector, and the broader patronage networks. That means offering carrots as well as sticks: sanctions relief in exchange for democratic reforms, investment in exchange for transparency, and security guarantees in exchange for demilitarization. But let's be that's not the kind of policy Washington is good at. We're much better at grand gestures, sanctions, summits, and sternly worded statements than at the patient, pragmatic diplomacy that Venezuela actually needs. Until that changes, Maduro will keep playing the same game, and the Venezuelan people will keep paying the price. The Essequibo crisis is just the latest chapter in that story. The question is whether anyone in Washington is paying attention. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader unraveling of the post-Cold War order in Latin America. Maduro's move on the Essequibo isn't an isolated gambit, it's a calculated test of how far he can push before the international system pushes back. And so far, the answer: not very far. The silence from Brazil, Colombia, and even the OAS has been deafening. That tells me something: the region is exhausted by Venezuela's crisis, and the old consensus around democracy promotion has collapsed. Let me explain why this matters. For decades, the US and its allies operated under the assumption that economic pressure and diplomatic isolation would eventually force Maduro to negotiate or collapse. But that assumption was always flawed. It ignored the fact that Venezuela's regime isn't a traditional dictatorship, it's a hybrid system where the military, the state oil company PDVSA, and a network of crony capitalists all have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Sanctions didn't break the system, they just forced it to adapt. The black market economy, gold smuggling, and cryptocurrency have kept the regime afloat, while the military's control over food distribution and fuel subsidies has ensured its loyalty. Here's the uncomfortable: the US and its allies have been playing checkers while Maduro plays chess. Every time Washington imposes a new round of sanctions, the regime finds a workaround. Every time the opposition gains momentum, the government cracks down. And every time the international community calls for free elections, Maduro holds a sham vote and declares victory. The pattern is so predictable it's almost boring. But the stakes couldn't be higher. Take the 2018 presidential election, for example. The US and the Lima Group refused to recognize the results, calling them a fraud. Maduro won anyway, and the opposition was left in disarray. Fast forward to 2024, and the same script is playing out. The opposition has united behind a single candidate, Maria Corina Machado, who won a primary with over 90% of the vote. But the regime has already disqualified her from running, and the military is standing by Maduro. The US has responded with more sanctions, but what good are sanctions if they don't change the calculus of the people who actually hold power? This is where grand strategy comes into play. If the goal is to stabilize Venezuela and prevent further regional destabilization, then the US and its allies need to rethink their approach. Sanctions alone won't work. Neither will empty rhetoric about democracy. What's needed is a strategy that addresses the three pillars of the regimes: the military, the oil sector, and the patronage networks. First, the military. The generals aren't ideologues, they're pragmatists. They've stuck with Maduro because he's given them control over key sectors of the economy, from food imports to gold mining. But their loyalty isn't absolute. If the US and its allies can offer them a credible off-ramp amnesty, security guarantees, or even a role in a transitional government, they might be willing to abandon Maduro. The key is to make them an offer they can't refuse. Second, the oil sector. Venezuela's economy is a one-trick pony, and that trick is oil. The US has tried to strangle PDVSA with sanctions, but the Comey has found ways to keep selling oil through intermediaries in China, India, and even Europe. Instead of trying to cut off Venezuela's oil exports entirely, the US should consider a more targeted offering sanctions relief in exchange for transparency and reforms. For example, the US could allow limited oil sales if PDVSA agrees to independent audits and reinvests the profits in infrastructure rather than regime cronies. Third, the patronage networks. Maduro's regime survives because it has a vast network of allies who benefit from corruption and state control. The US and its allies need to find ways to peel these actors away from the regime. That could mean offering economic incentives to business leaders who break with Maduro, or providing support to local governments that resist central control. The goal isn't to overthrow the regime, it's to create enough pressure from within that the regime is forced to negotiate. But here's the: none of this will work if the US and its allies aren't willing to play the long game. Venezuela's crisis didn't happen overnight, and it won't be resolved overnight. The US has a habit of lurching from crisis to crisis, with little regard for the consequences of its actions. In 2019, the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, only to abandon him when the strategy failed. In 2020, it indicted Maduro on drug trafficking charges, but the indictment did nothing to weaken his grip on power. And in 2023, it imposed new sanctions on Venezuela's gold sector, but the regime simply found new buyers. The problem isn't that the US lacks tools, it's that it lacks patience. Venezuela needs a strategy, not a series of tactical moves. And that strategy has to be based on a clear-eyed assessment of what's possible, not what we wish were possible. So what are the alternatives? One option is to double down on the current: more sanctions, more isolation, and more pressure on Maduro to step down. But as we've seen, that approach hasn't worked. Another option is to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere and focus on managing the crisis rather than resolving it. That could mean engaging with the regime on issues like migration, drug trafficking, and regional security, while keeping the door open for future negotiations. A third option, and the one I think is most realistic, is to pursue a hybrid: maintain pressure on the regime while offering incentives for reform. That could mean targeted sanctions on key figures, combined with offers of sanctions relief for concrete steps toward democracy. It could also mean working with regional allies to create a coalition of countries willing to engage with Venezuela on pragmatic terms. But whatever approach the US and its allies choose, they need to be honest about the trade-offs. Engaging with Maduro's regime might help stabilize Venezuela in the short term, but it could also legitimize his rule and undermine the opposition. On the other hand, continuing to isolate Venezuela could push the country further into the arms of Russia and China, which are already deepening their ties with Caracas. Here's the bottom: Venezuela's crisis is a test of the international system's ability to adapt to a new era of geopolitical competition. The old tools of democracy promotion and economic pressure aren't working, and the US and its allies need to find new ones. That means thinking creatively about how to engage with the forces that actually sustain the regime, rather than just the regime itself. It also means recognizing that the US can't solve Venezuela's crisis alone. The region is tired of Washington's heavy-handed approach, and any solution will require the buy-in of countries like Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. That's why the silence from these countries in the wake of the Essequibo crisis is so troubling. It suggests that the old consensus around democracy and human rights in Latin America is breaking down, and that the region is increasingly willing to go its own way. In the end, Venezuela's crisis is a microcosm of the broader challenges facing the international system. The post-Cold War order is unraveling, and the US is struggling to adapt. The question is whether Washington can find a way to navigate this new landscape, or whether it will continue to cling to old strategies that no longer work. For the Venezuelan people, the stakes couldn't be higher. They've endured hyperinflation, mass migration, and political repression for over a decade. The Essequibo crisis is just the latest chapter in their suffering. The question is whether anyone in Washington or anywhere else is paying attention. Because if we're not careful, Venezuela's crisis could become a permanent feature of the regional landscape, with consequences that extend far beyond its borders. And that's a future none of us should want.